Alright, in the previous videos we looked at the core crafting flow and how recipes define what a craft actually is. In this scene we're introducing workbenches and, more importantly, how they control access to crafting. You'll notice straight away there's a warning in the console. That's intentional. This scene is set up with two workbenches, one that works and one that's configured to fail. In this case, the failing bench has a station filter that doesn't match the selected recipe station tag. So instead of hiding that, we surface it. This scene is here to demonstrate how bench-side validation works. There's also a reminder in the scene itself, so it's clear this isn't an error. These workbenches come from the Crafting Unity integration layer. They're optional, but for most Unity projects, they'll be the practical way you expose crafting in-world. They sit on top of the core system, handling interaction and filtering, and then passing valid requests through to the crafting service. Before we run it, just a quick look at the setup. Like in the quick start, we've got a permissive authority binder and fake inventory and currency in the scene, just to keep things simple and visible while we focus on the workbench behaviour. Now, the main teaching surface for this scene is the workbench panel. This is wired up to the crafting service, an owner, and the benches in the scene. So everything we do here is going through the real system. Each bench also has its own set of recipes and a station filter configured. Alright, let's hit play and see how this behaves. We've got the workbench panel on screen, and this shows us what the system sees from the bench's point of view. Before we start testing the benches, I'm just going to seed some items and currency using the fake panels, just so we've got a valid baseline to work from. Alright, now we're good. This just gives us a clean baseline, so we can focus on the workbench behaviour, not missing resources. Let's start on the Overview tab. Here we can see which bench we're interacting with, which recipe is currently selected, and how the bench is configured. If we look at this first bench, you'll see the selected recipe has a station tag, and the bench has its own station filter. On this one, those don't match. So even though the recipe itself is valid, the bench rejects it. That's the first important idea. Being at a bench is not the same as being allowed to craft. Now, this bench actually has multiple recipes configured. If we switch to a different recipe, you can see this one does match the station filter, and now the bench allows it. So this bench will allow some recipes and reject others, depending on how they're configured. But this setup is here to demonstrate the failure case. So let's switch over to the other bench, where everything is aligned. And this is where we've got the correct items and currency for the recipe. Now let's make that behaviour clearer. If we move over to the Gates tab, this breaks things down into three layers. First, the bench gate. This is local to the workbench. Is there a recipe selected? Does the station tag match? Is the player in range? Then, the service gate. This is the same Preflight we saw earlier. Do we have enough items? Enough currency? Enough space? And finally, the runtime state, which only exists once a job has actually been created. Right now, if the station tag doesn't match, we fail at the very first step. The bench blocks the request before the crafting service even gets involved. Now, let's look at interaction. When the player is inside the trigger, pressing F will attempt to craft. And this scene is mapped to the F key, but you can change that in the inspector. If the player is outside the trigger, pressing F does nothing. That's the real in-world interaction path. One important detail, the panel now respects the bench interaction zone as well. So the panel buttons are not a bypass for range. If the player is outside the bench trigger, those bench-style craft actions are blocked. That keeps the teaching panel aligned with the real interaction path. The panel is still useful because it shows us what the bench sees, whether the player is in range, whether the station filter matches, and whether the service preflight would allow the craft. So the F key and the panel are both teaching the same rule. You need to be inside the interaction zone, and the recipe still has to pass the bench gate. So the key takeaway from this scene is workbenches don't replace the crafting system. They control access to it. They add an extra layer of validation before anything reaches preflight. And in this case, the validation is based on station tags. Once you understand that separation, the bench decides, can I try this here? The service decides, can this actually run? Everything becomes much easier to reason about. There's quite a bit more going on under the hood here. Input handling, trigger state, authority. But the important part for now is how the bench decides whether a craft is allowed. In the next video, we'll build on this and look at how the system decides what actually happens during a craft, including output routing, space checks, and currency. But for now, that's how workbenches fit into the crafting system.